our car out there. She might get into a scrape.
Oh.
On this week's Video Game Nation, it's part 2 of our 4-part series on the last 40 years of gaming.
I hit the 1990s, the decade where Mario went 3D, violence went extreme, and nobody knew what a polygon was. Dan fights Hellspawn in space.
Doom wasn't a game about violence for violence's sake.
Aoife meets the Umbrella Corporation.
Back in 1996, you'd have to rely on a magazine, an expensive phone line, or just good old-fashioned word of mouth.
And our team of journalists chart the decade that started with a naked hedgehog and ended with a solid snake.
The main legacy is Kojima's got a lot to answer for in terms of the length of modern cutscenes. The Order 1886 is basically his fault.
All that right here on Video Game Nation. Hello television friends. Hi Def. High five. Today we're going to look at the 10 most influential games of the 1990s, which is the decade that started off as a gritty reboot of the 80s and finished as a gritty reboot of itself. PCs were slow, Macs were rare, and the internet could spend half an hour downloading a picture of some woman's shoulder until your mother picked up the phone and ruined it for everyone.
Now these are the 10 most influential games of the decade, not the best, just the games that really laid the foundations for what we play today. And this is the decade that innovated genres, got politicians concerned about realism, and also showed us just how funny games could be.
Well, Secret of Monkey Island was really landmark just because it invented the Scum engine, which was the graphical engine that pretty much everything followed on with from there on. All the LucasArts games, because there's a whole slew of brilliant LucasArts games, but you had the Scum engine in there that really made this game work brilliantly with combining everything into everything else. And it was really funny as well. They actually managed to deliver funny dialogue, which is rare for a game.
It just elevated point-and-click adventures beyond simple puzzle solving towards like actual entertainment. It was kind of like the Princess Bride of video games, I think, in that it worked on so many different levels.
Secret of Monkey Island, I think, showed that point-and-click adventures didn't have to be sort of just lewd and mature like, you know, the Leisure Suit Larry games, which are around at the same time, the Sierra games. They could be incredibly well written, they could be really funny, they could be surprising, and they could be original. They could show you a pirate adventure and take it away from the usual sort of tropes that we're used to, turn things on their head, and show that video games can be grown up, not in just a naughty way, but also in just a really funny, well-written way.
For me, it was the first game to really use humour successfully, because a lot of games have tried it before, but it never really worked. Plus, it's got a rubber chicken with a pulley in the middle. Who doesn't want that?
You know, Monkey Island is probably best known for its sense of humour, but it did a lot more than make people laugh. Monkey Island was a brilliant case for the argument that games didn't have to have simple stories that did little else other than facilitate the action. They could have a little fun with themselves and with players and actually work that into gameplay instead of just having it exist purely as background noise. Not that there's anything wrong with a game that focuses solely on the joy of pure gameplay, as this next title is about to prove. On your marks?
So Super Mario Kart was, I think, the first weapon-based racer. If it wasn't the first, it was definitely one of the first. It was one which managed to get the idea of what we call rubber banding. So rubber banding is this thing where, okay, fine, you might be the best, which means you're the best at all the turns and all the, you know, getting the right line and everything, and you can be at the front, but then, someone's got a red shell and you've been knocked back anyway. It's kind of, there's an inherent unfairness to Mario Kart, which is what's so brilliant about it. It's very, very well tuned. It means that you can be the best and you can be skillful at Mario Kart, but equally there's always going to be that element of luck.
It's actually having a racing game that anyone can play, and it's not just for people who are into cars, it's just for people who like to annoy their friends by beating them, and that's everybody.
If you look at a game like Gran Turismo, I just don't really get it, because no matter how brilliantly you've recreated the rain falling on the tarmac, I'm ultimately still sitting in my living room in my pants. And I'm not an idiot. You're never going to convince me otherwise, really. But with Mario Kart, they just went, right, well, let's not make it realistic. Let's just make this video game the most fun version of this experience we possibly can.
And it was one of the first games as well that got all the different Mario characters together in one game. Like, it really kind of invented that sense of Mario being a whole universe. So all the Mario Kart levels were based around levels we'd seen in Super Mario World before and Super Mario Brothers before. So it kind of, it was almost like, you know, it was kind of like a Disneyland style experience. It was kind of magical to fans of Nintendo. It felt like you were kind of exploring the world while competing in a really, really fast, interesting game. It just brought a sense of humanity and warmth to driving games that hadn't really ever been there before.
It's hard to imagine a world without Mario Kart now. For Nintendo to take one of their most, their most iconic mascot and to plop them in a kart and create, even technically on the SNES, something that people didn't think was possible, this Mode 7 3D racer. It just blew people's minds when it came out.
Super Mario Kart, it added all the little power-ups and things like that, and the fact that you could screw mates over by just like firing shells at them and stuff like that. But also, it introduced the idea of, you've got a mascot, put him in a cart. Money. That was always the thing, like, just stick your mascot in a cart. It didn't really work for anyone else as well. There was Crash Team Racing, which was cool, but it was just like, put your mascot in a cart, get him going.
Yeah, I mean, it's another Mario game, so you're probably going to assume that I'm going to bang on about how great it is, but actually, it's not aged very well. If you go back and play it today, it's really brutal because it doesn't control in the way that we've become accustomed to games handling since in that sort of genre. But obviously, it spawned not only all the Mario Kart games, which is a great franchise, but karting as a subgenre of driving games. Like Mario Kart 8 still, it is one of the best ones ever. The original one's dreadful. Just don't work. Just bouncing off rocks and falling down holes. Waste of time.
The defining characteristic of the 1990s generation is that the best game of the decade is actually a sequel to a game you can't remember. And I know I said this was just going to be a list of the most influential, not the best, but Street Fighter 2 is my game. I grew up in Southeast Asia. That's right, Australia's in Southeast Asia. Don't let us tell you we're not. And Street Fighter 2 was the only game that you could hear in the arcade wherever it was. Because of all of that Hadouken, Tiger, Yoga Fire. What the hell is Yoga Fire?
It popularised a genre. Every 2D and 3D fighter owes a debt to Street Fighter 2. With that big roster of characters, special moves that were iconic because they were well designed and easy to do, different backgrounds, breakable environments. It wasn't the first game to do some of this stuff, but everything it did, it was the best at.
You can see it in everything, from King of Fighters to Dead or Alive to My Keyring.
Now, you might be thinking, where's Mortal Kombat? Didn't it cause a moral panic? Oh, it did, and fatalities were cool, but here's a game that sparked outrage and spawned a whole genre. Wolfenstein was the prototype, but before they called them first-person shooters, they called them clones of Doom.
Wolfenstein 3D might be regarded as the original first-person shooter, but Doom, which astonishingly came from the same developer just a year later, was the first essential one. Boasting an oppressive atmosphere of dread and despair, a soundtrack influenced by the finest metal of the era, and ludicrous jibs by the sackful, Doom was the game for a generation of disillusioned, hormonal teens seeking the sort of catharsis that real life couldn't offer. Not that I know anything about that, but Doom wasn't a game about violence for violence's sake. If anything, it was quite a cerebral exercise in solving a series of intricately constructed labyrinths that, yes, just so happened to be populated by armies of Hellspawn. This intoxicating mix of exploration and evisceration in a terrifying remote environment evoked the best cult cinema of the era. The claustrophobic corridors are straight out of the Alien films, while the gleeful inclusion of shotguns, chainsaws, and supernatural horrors are pure Evil Dead. And if the fact it transformed the FPS from gimmick to game changer isn't influential enough for you, I have one compound word to change your mind: deathmatch. Yes, our love affair with blowing our friends to smithereens started right here. So if you're a fan of Quake, Call of Duty, Counter-Strike, Battlefield, Halo, Destiny, and everything in between, you know what to thank. In fact, Doom was my very first experience of LAN gaming, and as coincidence would have it, this strategy classic from Westwood Studios was my second.
Reinforcements have arrived. Command & Conquer was so successful because it was actually quite a complex game, but sort of delivered in quite an accessible manner. And ultimately that just made it sort of fun to play. And I think, yeah, something that was like RTS, real-time strategy, didn't have to be sort of, you know, desperately ponderous and spending hours and hours setting things up and fiddly, and it was just a really great game.
What Command & Conquer did was it produced this perfect compulsion loop of create units, look for resources, create buildings, and then go back to the beginning again. It was just a perfect loop. It also had an amazing kind of what people call on-ramp design-wise. So you could get into it very easily, but the difficulty would ramp up at exactly the right rate. So it had this an amazing kind of introductory structure to it. So, you know, you started off very basically with very basic units, but as you grew as a player, so your kind of inventory grew in a really natural, progressive way. So it was beautifully designed.
Right away, sir.
I never really got into real-time strategy games. I was more into turn-based stuff like Civilization, which is a shame because obviously these days you've got things like Dota, League of Legends. They're massive. They're the only way to make any real money in gaming, and I'm dreadful at them.
Command & Conquer's a brilliant game. One of the best things that it did was it added the real-life actors in little videos, which has been sort of a staple in a lot of these games now. And there's one, I just really want this to be on television, one little bit with Tim Curry, where he talks about how capitalism's not going to be able to get him where he's going, which is, and then he gives a little pause, like, space! And it's the most beautiful, hammy, cheesy performance ever that's perfect, just sums up Command & Conquer.
Space!
Everyone I went to school with loved Command & Conquer. We were all GDI. We were all the Brotherhood of Nod. We all knew all the lyrics to I'm a mechanical, I'm a mechanical, I'm a mechanical man. Here's a hint, those are all the lyrics. Real-time strategy had arrived with a gun in one hand and multiplayer in the other, and chess would never be as sexy again. After the break, more innovation, more controversy, but until then, tweet at us at #VGN, head over to the Videogame Nation Facebook page, and I'll see you in just a bit.
Super Mario 64 nailed that straight off the bat.
Shoot! Oh, no.
End is near. I see the light.
No.
Welcome back. As the 90s wore on and tech power went up, 3D became the focus in game design. For the very first time, the games industry had a silent movies to talkies moment. Which franchises were going to be able to make the leap to 3 dimensions? And everybody tried. Bubsy, Earthworm Jim, Lemmings. You remember Lemmings? The game about suicidal vermin? Lemmings. 3D had arrived, and of course there's one title that really made the jump. Now, some of you will be thinking, oh, here comes Ocarina of Time. No, you sit there with your Ocarina and you play your Song of Storms. There is only one 3D game to define a whole genre, and that is Super Mario 64.
Dear Mario, please come to the castle. I have baked a cake for you. Yours truly, Princess Toadstool. Peach.
I think Mario 64 is incredible because Mario 64 took what could have been just such an easy brief, you know, take Super Mario Brothers, the amazing 2D platformer that has been, you know, thrilling kids for generations, and just make it in 3D. And originally they actually were going to put the camera on the side of Mario and have it all be this sort of bizarre 3D game where you could, like, you know, control him from the side, but then you could go into the background in like a sort of seamless way. It was odd, it was really odd. But instead, they actually made it a game that was completely different. So rather than having a linear level with a flagpole at the end, now you had this kind of open level with multiple objectives that you could keep going into. And you could sometimes do those objectives in different orders. You didn't have to do everything in this linear way. And it really helped make the game feel like something that you could explore.
I mean, firstly, it's a great game. It's absolutely incredible. It still stands up today, but rather than talk about the gameplay or the 3D world and those things, the thing that a lot of people forget about that game is that it nailed dynamic cameras in a 3D environment. There was a lot of games in the early years of the N64 and the PlayStation where the camera was more of a nuisance than a help, but Super Mario 64 nailed that straight off the bat.
There was nothing else like it at the time, and to preserve that feeling of fine control in a beautiful world, handcrafted levels, but to allow that in full 360-degree motion, that was an insurmountable challenge for Nintendo, and they nailed it, and they created a genre on top of the genre that they'd originally made. It's just an astounding game, and it still stands today as one of the greatest 3D platformers in existence.
I think Nintendo actually did quite a brave thing with Mario 64, where they took an iconic character, arguably the most iconic character in the world of video games, and they literally turned his world around, you know, and going from 2D to 3D, you know, it was a huge deal for that company and for that mascot, and it worked. It was a gamble that paid off. So I think in that sense it showed, you know, to other companies, yes, we're ready now. This is it. We're doing the next step now.
I think it was probably the moment where, like, obviously, you know, we've had all these kind of Mario games, different iterations, and then suddenly it was like 3D. It was like Nintendo had gone, oh my goodness, we could just kind of do a really, like, similar game, but if we make it in 3D, or like, you know, Paper Mario, or like, you know, it's just, if we take him and kind of change him a little bit, it's a completely different game. So we could do that for a while. That's literally our to-do list for, like, the next 20 years.
Here we go!
It all began with a mansion. Through those double doors, players, along with Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and the rest of the STARS crew, would get a taste of real survival horror gaming. And though looking back on it now, it all feels a bit naff, those live-action character intros especially, at the time it changed the rules about what horror gaming could be. It didn't patronise, it threw in quite a few unexpected twists and turns, and it made players seriously think about their surroundings and their inventory. Do you absolutely need that extra magazine now? Or should you take this gemstone in the hope that it'll open up the way ahead? Nowadays, if you get stuck on a game, you can just look up an FAQ or a walkthrough or ask a friend on Twitter on how best to proceed, but back in 1996, you'd have to rely on a magazine, an expensive phone line, or just good old-fashioned word of mouth. These were the games that you kept a notepad and pencil close by to remind yourself what you had, what you saw, or what key code that last file mentioned. We all remember the zombies as Resident Evil's bad guys, but the mansion's locked doors often represented even more of a challenge.
Barry! Where's Barry?
But as much as I love Jill, the master of unlocking, that very same year, another badass lady would come along and claim instant celebrity status that would last to this day.
I feel like the importance of, like, Lara gets overstated a bit, and it drives me a bit bonkers, because, you know, at the time it seemed like this massive deal, like, oh, it's a woman, like a member of 50% of the population has been allowed to be in one video game, this is the revolution, you know. I just, you know, but here we are 20 years later, and like, who has there been since?
So Lara Croft is one of those kind of weird characters that, obviously, in its, you know, original iteration, it was a kind of hyper, quite sexualized character, but it was confusing in the fact that she was really, really cool and was actually really, really good at what she did. So it's this kind of weird thing where you're like, well, I don't really appreciate that side of it because that's quite offensive. But on the other hand, she's amazing. Like, maybe she should be allowed to do it because she's so good. Maybe that counteracts it.
Lara was there saying games are kind of glamorous, they're exciting. So that was really, really important. You know, from a marketing perspective, Lara Croft was a figurehead in an industry which didn't really have figureheads before.
But I think the original Tomb Raider and the original idea of Lara was something a little bit better than that. I think it was an idea to try and make, you know, this female action star. And I think, you know, it's almost a bit sad that today she's still one of the top represented women in video games, because that was 20 years ago.
If the 80s were a pivotal era for cute gaming icons, the 90s signaled the dawn of the grown-up gaming icon. Despite looking like Red Dwarf's Crichton in drag, Lara Croft's crude femininity was enough to make her stand out from the crowd, and it wasn't long until the Tomb Raider star was adorning magazine covers and appearing in energy drink ads. No other character has really come anywhere near achieving the same level of mainstream recognition since, but Lara's success marked a change in appetite for memorable heroes that we either wanted to be or be with, just like the hero of our next game, in fact.
For me, those early Metal Gear Solid games are so important because they kind of had a sense of humour, you know, and they knew when they were taking themselves a bit seriously. And they also weren't afraid to break the fourth wall. So all that stuff of putting the controller on the floor and it vibrating and all that. I just think, you know, Kojima really had fun with the medium and again, it's about saying, look, you know, let's not pretend that we really are this little man hiding behind a cardboard box in this industrial complex. Let's acknowledge that this is a human interaction with a machine, and let's enjoy both aspects of gaming.
Metal Gear Solid was crazily influential, not just on me personally, but on games in general, because it was the first time that I ever played a game, and I think it was the first game that it actually said, oh no, there's a really good narrative in here. I know it's stupid now, you look back on it now, but at the time it was like, there's a brilliant narrative in here and amazing voice acting, which even at the time with stuff like Resident Evil was really rare. And Metal Gear Solid was just like, no, we want to make this filmic. We want to make this like something you'd see on a screen, not just on a computer screen. So let's really go full hog. We're trying to tell an amazing story.
Metal Gear Solid introduced just new ways of approaching levels, new ways of approaching challenges and enemies and getting around them, and it just brought stealth to the mainstream.
I think of all the stealth games that have been and gone, Metal Gear Solid was the one that got stealth really, really right. And a lot of that was to do with the way that it visually and like audibly made the stealth and not being in stealth work. You know, it's so iconic, that exclamation mark and that noise. You know, you see a lot of games, you know, it's interesting to see games like Splinter Cell kind of move more towards Metal Gear Solid as time's gone by.
I don't know. I never got into them. I tried. No, I didn't. I tried to play 4, but I hadn't got a clue what was going on. I know a lot of people really love them, but I think the main legacy is Kojima's got a lot to answer for in terms of the length of modern cutscenes. The Order 1886 is basically his fault.
Surrender yourself! Raise your hands now!
I think almost everyone I know who's my age bought a Game Boy for Pokémon. It was a weird case of a system that had kind of had its day. It had been and gone. It came out in 1989, the Game Boy, and it went on for a few years, had some big games, and then was sort of in a recession. And then Pokémon comes along in 1998 and just, it's like, vroom, by the way, you want Game Boy? Let's go buy Game Boys.
I'm afraid I find it quite difficult to talk about Pokémon because I had a very emotional experience with Pokémon Red, which I played and loved, and I got quite far in it. I think I had about 80 Pokémon. And I was with my friend John one day and he was waiting for his train and he said, oh, give us a go. And I said, oh, all right, you know, just be careful. And I gave him the Game Boy Color and he had a little play, gave it back, got on his train, and sure enough, he deleted my entire Pokédex. So he basically killed all of my Pokémon. And I texted him and I told him what had happened, and you know, he said, oh, you know, I'm really sorry, oh, it's just an accident. I said, oh, it's all right, you know, it's just a video game, it doesn't matter, just, you know, just never contact me again. And I slept with his boyfriend.
Well, Pokémon took handheld gaming, and much like Tetris, it made it very much in the mainstream for kids at the time, because it was like, catch 'em all. And the only way you're going to do it is on your Game Boy. If you sit there, you can link up with your friends. So it had that social element to it with a little link-up wire, which was a massive thing for handheld games at the time.
These days with Pokemon, you can go on a web forum and agree to log in at the same time as someone you met online and just swap them. Like back in the day, you used to have to get your Game Boy Link cable, and if you heard somebody at school that had got a Pokemon you hadn't, you'd have to walk to their house and plug in, swap it and walk back. Pokemon back then probably did far more for childhood obesity than Wii Fit ever did.
Pokemon was an RPG for people who'd never played an RPG and never ever would. I used to know folks who would throw up laughing if you asked them to be a mage or a cleric, and yet they were so happy to tell you about the health of their Charizard. Next week, part 3 of our 4-parter, and it's the 2000s. Tweet at us at #VGN, visit us on Facebook at Videogame Nation, and I will see you next week.
Bullseye is tonight at 8:05 on Challenge. It's got something for everyone. There's darts for sports fans, some nifty prizes for fans of stuff, and some blimmin' big glasses for any spectacle fans out there.